And if I lose liberty, then it takes away the basic reason for living.
So what is
if you're the sort of person who doesn't mind about having any liberty, provided you've got a house and food coming to you and you will do what you're told to do, then perhaps you won't mind. I suppose it's the difference between being born free and living life like an animal at the zoo in a cage.
We fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds.
Thank you for joining us. You are listening to A Radio, and this is the Morning Moment. We're on weekdays, 11:45 Eastern. Follow us on Spreaker.com and click on the like button. Christians being not persecuted but murdered worldwide. That's the title of this piece. It's not just murder though, it's genocide. For years this has been going on. For years. This is nothing new. My friend, and I like to think colleague, Hutch Bailey Jr., has been highlighting attacks on Christians for years on his show Cold War Radio and WHBJ-DB. He's been tireless in his efforts to try and report this issue, but up to now, nothing. On the other hand, some attack by some whackball on a Muslim installation of any type gets wall-to-wall coverage. Why is that? Why is it that Islam is headline news, but Christians aren't worth a darn? And why is it that the ruling class supposedly have finally woken up to this? Well, I have a theory. It's a simple one. It's entitled Donald Trump. They thought they were going to get rid of him. They thought they could carry on as usual. But now they've finally realised he's in for the long haul, and finally real investigations will happen. They have to admit that everything that he's been saying about what's been going on in the Middle East and the West is true. However, they can't be seen to be backing down openly. Why? Well, that answer is also very simple. That would show how shallow they have been, and more importantly, it would expose their Middle East and African open door policy to Europe, let alone the United States. I believe this is all linked. I have a number of pieces here, all quoting the same individual. It's the British Foreign Secretary, who holds a lot of sway in the world. Finally, a Western country who is seriously looking into reports of what I call genocide on Christians. Now, whether things will change in the UK and Europe remains to be seen, but it has to be seen as a big chink in the world's armour of denial. Now, this piece is actually from the government website, and I will put a link to that. That's the British government's website, by the way. It's entitled Foreign Secretary Announces Global Review into Persecution of Christians. Now, this piece can be found on their website and many other places. I will put links to all the people who quote this. It goes as follows, and the Foreign Secretary's name is Jeremy Hunt. I didn't know that, but anyway. Yesterday, my family and I walked a short journey to our local church and enjoyed an uplifting Christmas service. We attend as a simple matter of personal choice, but since being appointed Foreign Secretary, it has struck me how much we take that choice for granted. Others around the world are facing death, torture and imprisonment for that very right. It is distressingly poignant at Christmas to hear recent warnings that the persecution facing Christians across the globe is now more stark in the region of its birth. A century ago, 20% of the people in the Middle East were Christian. Today, that figure is now 5%. I'm just going to repeat that again. A century ago, that's 100 years ago, it was 20%. Now it's 5%. Do you think that's happened by accident? I don't. Anyway, the piece continues. It is not hard to see why, on Palm Sunday in 2017, a suicide bomber in Egypt attacked a Christian cathedral that had existed since the inception of Christianity, brutally killing 17 of the congregation. This is an extreme example, but it is by no means isolated. Now, obviously, this piece is not up to date, but he's finally acknowledging there's something going on. Last week, I met an Iraqi doctor who told me how patients had threatened her and her family with beheading when they heard she was a Christian who refused to convert. I'm going to stop it there. I don't know where this mindless numbnut has been, But this has been going on for decades, and he's finally woken up? This is the trouble with these people who live in these warm and fluffy worlds, not acknowledging what's really going on. I have a family member like that, by the way. Anyway, step by agonizing step, we are witnessing the erosion of Christianity as a living religion in its heartland. Elsewhere, the situation is also deeply perilous. Across the world, 215 million Christians suffer persecution, according to the campaign group Open Doors. The International Society for Human Rights has found that Christians are victims of 80% of all acts of religious discrimination. Now, I just want to repeat that again for my Canadian population and the Canadian members of Parliament who promote hate speech laws. Let's just play that again. Just say that again, shall we? The International Society of Human Rights has found that Christians are the victims of 80% of all acts of religious discrimination. 80%, Mr. Trudeau. 80. 80. Not 20. 80. That's why Mr. Trudeau needs to be removed. Anyway, I continue. Like the Christian family I met recently, who were accused of blasphemy in Pakistan. Now, I'm going to interject again there because I just get aggravated about this garbage. All Western countries should break off immediately, without exception, diplomatic relations with Pakistan. They are not democratic, they do not hold to the rule of law, and they victimize, persecute, and kill Christians en masse. They stand back and do nothing. Their country is responsible for more terrorism outside of Iran than anywhere else. Yet we carry on as though they're a normal player in the world. They're not. The article continues. They told me how extremists targeted them and attacked their young sons by ripping school uniforms off their bodies and shot at their mother. There were striking parallels with the case of Aisha Bibi, a Christian Pakistani woman who was beaten, imprisoned, and despite being acquitted, still lives under constant guard because of the threat of mob justice, whose plight moved the hearts of the British public. Now, I'm going to interject there because the next piece I'm going to read to you is a complete lie. This is the Foreign Secretary. That's the second in command, so to speak, in the British government. Very, very top job. Has just said that. I'll read it again to you, then I'm going to tell you what I'm going to say. There were striking parallels with the case of Aisha Bibi, a Christian Pakistani woman who was beaten, imprisoned, and despite being acquitted, still lives under constant guard because of threat of mob justice, whose plight moved the hearts of the British public. There was pressure in Britain by certain ethnic groups to block her request for political asylum in the UK. She was blocked, and you know who took it up? The British Prime Minister, Theresa May. So what I'm going to read to you next shows how fake they are. How fake they are. Britain has long championed international religious freedom, and the Prime Minister underlined our global leadership on this issue when she appointed my excellent colleague Lord Ahmad as a special envoy for freedom of religion or belief. I want you to think about what I just said then. Britain has long championed international religious freedom, and the Prime Minister underlined our global leadership on this issue when she appointed the excellent colleague Lord Ahmad as her special envoy for freedom of religion or belief. Now that to me says it all. Says it all. The piece continues. So often the persecution of Christians is a telling early warning sign of persecution of every minority. Really? Okay. But I am not convinced that our response to the threats facing this particular group, describing Christians as a group, okay, has always matched the scale of the problem, nor taken into account the hard evidence that Christians often endure disproportionate burden of persecution. No kidding. Perhaps this is born out of the very British sense of awkwardness at doing God. Quote, I don't know what that means. Perhaps it's an awareness of our colonial history, or because Britain is a traditionally Christian country, some are fearful of being seen to help Christians in desperate need. That might be a little closer to the truth, I think. Whatever the cause, we must never allow a misguided political correctness to inhibit our response to the persecution of any religious community. Yeah, okay. Well, why don't you tell that to your boss, Theresa May, who blocked Aisha Bibi's request for political asylum in the UK due to, how can we put this, pressure from an ethnic group, unquote. I live in Canada, so I can't say what I want to say, but read between the lines, folks, and you'll get the gist. So I have asked the Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, Bishop of Truro, to lead an independent review of whether we are doing all we can. I would like this exercise to consider some tough questions and offer ambitious policy recommendations. Britain has, in my view, the best diplomatic network in the world. So how can we use this to encourage countries to provide proper security for minority groups under threat? Have we been generous enough in offering practical assistance? And does the level of UK support match the scale of the suffering? Have we always got our foreign policy priorities right in terms of advocating for and expressing solidarity with this group? There they are again, describing Christians as a group that is trying to minimise Christianity. Right there. The article continues. I am far from the most eloquent person to speak out about this problem. Right. From Prince Charles to the Archbishop of Canterbury, parliamentarians across the political spectrum, we have been warned many times, but with Christianity on the verge of extinction in its birthplace, it's time for concerted action that begins to turn the tide. I have asked Bishop Mount Stephen to report back to me by Easter. Britain has a strong history for standing up for the rights of all religious communities. Well, it did have, didn't it? I am proud of the way the UK has led the world in condemnation of the ethnic cleansing of the Muslim Rohingya community in Burma, as well as our response of passionate anger to the recent resurgence of anti-Semitism in our own society. It is not in our national character to turn a blind eye to suffering. All religious minorities must be protected, and the evidence demonstrates that in some countries, Christians face the greatest risk. Mr. Foreign Secretary, look in your own backyard before you make comments like that. We should be willing, it continues, to state that simple fact and adjust our policies accordingly. The Apostle Paul foretold of the suffering that Christians would face through the ages, but still saw reason to hope. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed. It is time to echo that message of hope to the persecuted church around the world, with our deeds as well as our words. Well, there you heard it. Pious comments from a foreign secretary, which I find disgusting at the very least. Next, I'm going to play a clip, a rare clip from the BBC, who so covet their content that they make it very hard to report on strange, bearing in mind they are a national public broadcaster. They try and hide their coverage of events, a bit like how Fox is acting in the US, blocking linking of their reports. Anyway, we have an audio here. It's not the best, but I wanted you to hear it. How they comment on the attacks on Christians. It seems eerily similar to how the New York Times have suddenly seen the light in the US on the deep state attack on a US sitting president. Here's the piece. Sorry, there are no links to this, but you can hear it here anyway.
Christians are the most persecuted religious group in the world. This is according to a review commissioned by the UK government. It estimates that a total of 300 Christians are killed every month around the world. The review's interim findings suggest that Christianity could be wiped out in parts of the Middle East. Now, joining me is Henrietta Blythe, CEO of Open Doors, which supports persecuted Christians around the world, and the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, Bishop of Truro, who led the review. And let me begin with you. Bishop, do you think this was previously known? I think a lot of people, those figures that people are thinking about and talking about today could be astonishing.
I think people will be astonished by it. just like to say that the work of our review has been essentially to gather together an awful lot of material that actually has been out there in the public domain and has been known about for quite some time. But for whatever reason, I think people have had quite a blind spot to this issue. I mean, I know that Henrietta's in on this interview as well. This will come as no surprise to someone like Henrietta and the organisation that she works for. But I don't think the severity, the scale, and the seriousness of this phenomenon has really reached a broader public consciousness. No.
And Henrietta, why do you think that is?
I think people just haven't been aware of the extent of the violence and oppression that Christians are experiencing. Our research at Open Doors and the interim report amply demonstrates this, shows that 245 million Christians around the world are experiencing high levels of violence or oppression for their faith. That's 4 times the population of the UK, and it's underreported. The shocking thing is how few people know about it.
When we turn to this issue, why was this report commissioned?
I think at the launch, the Foreign Secretary was very interesting. He said that he feels that colonial guilt about our colonial
and I should say that it's the British Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, sorry, the British Foreign Secretary. Sorry,
audience,
yes.
No problem.
Sometimes we feel quite guilty about our colonial past in the UK, and what the Foreign Secretary said was he felt that as a result of that, perhaps Christians weren't always getting their fair share of the support they needed. So he commissioned the review to look at what was happening to Christians around the world and what was the Foreign Office here in the UK doing to support them or not, as the case may be.
And turning to you, Reverend, what do you feel needs to be done to try and protect Christians that are in places that are difficult? Of course, Sri Lanka at the forefront of many people's minds from those terrible attacks.
Yeah, well, that's basically the focus of the next stage of our review. So the review is taking 2 bites of the cherry, as it were. So the first piece of work that we're doing, which is what the result of which you see in the interim report that's just been published, the focus of that is to do a kind of mapping exercise. I mean, I don't pretend that what we've done is a comprehensive take on everything that's happening in the world, but we've tried to measure to some degree the scale, the scope, and the severity of the phenomenon. And then on the basis of that, we'll be drilling down into some specific contexts, some specific countries, looking at the way that the Foreign Office has responded to the pressure and the persecution that Christians have been under in those contexts. And then our job will be to formulate some recommendations to the Foreign Office for how they might act in a more responsive manner to this to this issue going forward. So we're not yet at the stage of making recommendations. But I think one of the things we will be wanting to say is that I think if the Foreign Office took this issue with the seriousness that we think it deserves, it will actually help them to do their job even better than they currently do. Because
I understand what you're saying, and I just want to get a brief word from Henrietta as well before we go. Are you hopeful that this review will make a difference?
I'm very hopeful. Yes, I think the proof of the pudding is always in actual change, so we'll wait and see. But the report makes very grim reading, and it amply demonstrates the horrific situations that many Christians find themselves in. So it's a great start.
Thank you so much for joining us. That's Henrietta Blythe, CEO of Open Doors, and also the Right Reverend Philip and Stephen Bishop of Truro. Thank you also to you, and you can find that report online.
Finally, I want to play a reasonably short clip from the Home Secretary himself speaking to the virtues of launching the inquiry. Here's that clip, and we do have links to that.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome this morning for this very important occasion and very significant launch. Last Sunday, many people here will have been going to church, as indeed was the case in the Philippines at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in the southern Philippines. And in the middle of that service, a bomb exploded and 20 people were killed, and the perpetrators then issued a hate-filled statement labelling the cathedral as a Crusader temple. And this was a very vivid reminder of the terrible truth that freedom of worship is something that can not only not be taken for granted, but is a growing concern all over the world. And what happened in the Philippines has happened in Egypt. We know now from the excellent Open Doors report that 250 million Christians are suffering some sort of persecution all over the world. And we know that a number of the countries where this happens are countries that we don't necessarily talk about, countries like Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, Libya, North Korea. But also in some of the bigger countries, we know that there are serious and growing issues in China, and also in countries where we might have hoped there wouldn't be a serious issue, like India. We know that this is becoming a much bigger issue. And as me and my team at the Foreign Office reflected on this, we wanted to ask ourselves the question as to whether the FCO, which has one of the best global networks of any diplomatic service, we basically, after the Americans and the Chinese, have the third biggest diplomatic network of any country alongside the French. And we wanted to ask ourselves the question as to whether we really are doing as much as we possibly could. And we wanted to do this not just because freedom of worship is a fundamental human right, but because also freedom of worship is the invisible line between open societies and closed societies. And where freedom of worship is hampered or prevented, then usually that's a sign of lots of other things going wrong. And we wanted to make sure that the UK is doing everything to champion the values that we all believe in. I am a Johnny-come-lately to this because we have in the Foreign Office a fantastic Minister, Lord Ahmed, who has been championing religious freedom since before I became Foreign Secretary, and himself comes from a Muslim minority faith, the Ahmadi community, that have effectively been banished from Pakistan because it's not safe for them to be in Pakistan, and have had to move away, and many of them are based in the UK, but actually all over the world. So this is someone who knows from his own life the dangers. But very much on his advice, we particularly want to look at the issue of Christian persecution, because the evidence is that 80% of all people who are suffering religious persecution are Christian. And we want to, if I can put it this way, banish any hesitation to look into this issue without fear or favour that may exist because of our imperial history, because of the concerns that some people might have in linking the activities of missionaries in the 19th century to misguided imperialism. And all those concerns may have led to a hesitation to really look at this issue properly, and we don't want that to happen. And in order to keep us on the straight and narrow, I've asked the Bishop of Truro, Bishop Philip Mount Stephen, to do an independent review and to work with all of you, to work with the FCO, and to tell us how we should approach this and what more we can do. And what I want to do is, what I'm hoping the outcome of this will be is, first of all, in practical terms, I want to make absolutely sure that when I am meeting a foreign minister, a prime minister or a president in another country, and there's an issue concerning religious freedom and in particular the rights of Christians, I want to make sure that it is absolutely on my list of things that I need to raise. Sometimes you do these things publicly, sometimes you do them privately, but we should always be doing them if they need to be done, and I want to make sure that happens, and I don't think it does at the moment.
Now I'm going to quote a piece now from, I believe it's the BBC. It's their news site. It says, Christians' persecution at near genocide levels. The persecution of Christians in parts of the world is at near genocide levels, according to a report by the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt. The review, led by the Bishop of Truro, the Right Reverend Philip Mount Stephen, estimated that 1 in 3 of the people suffer from religious persecution. Christians were the most persecuted religious group it found. Mr. Hunt said he felt that political correctness had played a part in the issue not being confronted. You don't say. The interim report, there are 3 bullet points here. Alarm over China's church crackdown. The second bullet point is religious persecution, a threat to everyone. Pope decries killing of Christians. The interim report said that the main impact genocidal acts against Christians is Exodus, unquote, and that Christianity faced being wiped out, that's in quotes, wiped out from parts of the Middle East. It warned the religion is at risk of disappearing, unquote, in some parts of the world, pointing to figures which claimed Christians in Palestine represent less than 1.5% of the population, while in Iraq they had fallen from 1.5 million in 2003 to less than 120,000. But of course, there's nothing to see here, folks. There's nothing going on. You're just distorting the religion of peace. You're just distorting it. Nothing to see here. Your hate-filled anger, your anger against one particular religion is disgusting. There's no basis for it at all. Yeah, right. Evidence shows, the article continues, not only that the geographical spread of anti-Christian persecution, but also its increasing severity, the bishop wrote. In some regions, the level and nature of persecution is arguably coming close to meeting the international definition of genocide, according to that adopted by the UN. The Foreign Secretary commissioned the review on Boxing Day 2018 amid the outcry over the treatment of Aisha Bibi, a Christian woman who faced death threats after being acquitted of blasphemy. Now there are 3 bullet points here that I want to highlight, and this is how the BBC distort things. Listen to these bullet points. The first one, Sri Lanka attacks, what we know. The second bullet point, who are the victims of Sri Lanka attacks? And here's the key one, London hate crimes soar since New Zealand attacks. Do you see what they've done? They've turned that back to Islam. Now, if you're not British, and why should you be, you wouldn't get the significance of that. In Britain, the universe revolves round London. Nothing happens unless it happens in London. It just doesn't. That's just the way Britain works. So they have to bring it back to England, and they have to bring it back to Islam, because this document is beginning to not quite go in the direction that the BBC and the left want it to go. So they have to put that little sting in. The article continues. Its findings come after 359 people were killed and more than 500 wounded in attacks at hotel churches in Sri Lanka. Do you see what they've done there? They've not given all the details on the Sri Lanka attack within that document that they produced. They've just said it's an attack. It's an Islam attack. It's a Muslim attack on a Christian church. Why can't they say that? They can't say it because political correctness. This is what things are going on today. This is why it's so dangerous to shrink news down to little bullet points. They should open that up and tell it how it is, but they won't do it. They just won't do it because they don't want to expose what's going on. They just want that little bit. 359 people were killed 359 Christians were killed in a church by Islamic extremists. That's what it should say, because that's a fact. That's not hate, that's a fact. But they won't do it, will they? They just won't do it. And on one of Christians' most sacred days, Easter Sunday. Why is it that they do things like that? They do it to minimise the religion in people's eyes. That's why they do it. That's why they do it. Mr. Hunt, who is on a 1-week-long tour of Africa, said he thought governments had been asleep over the persecution of Christians. But this report and the attacks in Sri Lanka had woken everybody up with an enormous shock. He added, "I think there is a misplaced worry that this is some sort of colonialist talk about religion, about a religion that was associated with colonial powers rather than the countries that we marched into as colonizers." What the heck has that got to do with the price of eggs? Unbelievable. Article continues with a subheading, Atmosphere of Political Correctness. That has perhaps created an awkwardness in talking about this issue. The role of missionaries was always a controversial one that has, I think, also led some people to shy away from this topic. What we have actually forgotten in the atmosphere of political correctness is actually the Christians that are being persecuted are some of the poorest people on the planet. In response to the report, the President of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, Marie van der Ziel, said Jews had often been the targets of persecution and felt for Christians who were being discriminated against on the basis of their faith. Whether it is in authoritarian regimes or bigotry masked in mistaken guise of religion, reports like the one launched today reminded us there are many places in which Christians face appalling levels of violence, abuse and harassment, she said. The review is due to publish its final findings in the summer this year, that's 2019. Well, there it is. There's the piece. But I just find it strange how late, I wanted to say something like how late they've joined the party, but somehow that doesn't sound appropriate for what is a worldwide UN-acknowledged genocide of Christians. Even the Pope is in utter denial, choosing to break bread with the very people who seek to destroy him and his church. How long can the West continue to ignore the very fight that is now on their doorstep for the very existence, for our very existence, let alone our right to be Christians? It has gone way past that time, way past. We have to call out ourselves for doing business, for allowing business as usual with countries that hate, yes, hate our very existence. But I doubt very much that these people will ever go that far. Far rather see a few million Christians murdered, allow the veneer of normality to continue. All the while, we're all waiting for the other shoe to drop. And it will drop pretty soon, believe me. I'm going to end with this, and this is not going to go down well. I have said to many friends and people I know, shall we say, on the radio, in media, many times, that you don't have to wait for this to come to you, because it's already here, because you let it in with your naive approach to the world, thinking everything's kumbaya, everything's rosy. And to my American friends, you've only got to look at Britain to see where it is now, to see where you will be in 20 years' time. I saw in the 80s, and I've told many people on someone's chat room what I saw in Rhode Island in the 80s. I knew what was coming, and people at the time, my friends in Rhode Island, laughed at me, said, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." I'm going to put it very simply, okay? As, was it Rush Limbaugh says, for those of you in Rio Linda. In the 80s, it was Mexicans taking over the United States, and they've done a pretty good job of that, because people on that chat room also believe that bilingualism is a good thing. Good luck with that. You tell that to your sons and daughters in 20 years' time, when they can't get jobs, because they don't speak Mexican first. That's what bilingualism is. It's not speaking English first, it's speaking the second language first, being fluent in the second language and not being fluent in the first language. But you'll find that out. Donald Trump has been right. He knows he's right. People don't like him. They don't like what he says because he's blunt and to the point. Now you have a separate group of people coming into your country, and now you've got them in Congress, that separate group, and you will find there'll be more and more pressure on you and your system of government to accommodate them. The first thing will be bilingualism, and the second thing, I'll leave you to your own imagination what that's going to be. But unless you act now, you will lose your country in your lifetime. And you'll look back, if you're in your 20s or 30s now, in 20 years' time, and say, what happened? What happened was you sat on your ass and did nothing. That's what happened. Now this comment is not politically correct. I'll get into trouble in Canada for it, I've no doubt. But it's true. I've done a piece which Hutch Bailey Jr. has from Enoch Powell, and he warned of the perils of multiculturalism. But this is far more than multiculturalism. I hope soon he'll play it, because it's very long. But listen to that, and you will hear undoubtedly warnings from history. Warnings from history. Attacking Christians is just the beginning. It's just the beginning. But if they succeed in taking your guns away in the United States, where does it end? You can find more at aradio.wordpress.com, where you can find links to us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Gab and email. We're also on Spotify. Just go to the podcast section and type Canadian Politics with a twist and you'll find us. We are continuing to reach out to you, so please pass on these links. Please click on the follow button on Spreaker.com. You can listen to all our morning moments at Spreaker.com under A Radio. That's EHRADIO, A Radio, and click on the like button. And you can hear a review of our morning moments on WHBJ-DB, News Talk Radio on Spreaker.com. Join us and many others. And you can find all our podcasts and morning moments at aradio.wordpress.com. Click on the Morning Moments tab.